So this is the sociocultural aspect of writing. We'll begin this. As you remember, there are 8 aspects to writing. If you don't remember that, I have videos on how they, on what the 8 are: the rhetorical, linguistic, aesthetic, technological, scientific, sociocultural, analytical, and structural. Those 8 aspects, if it helps you remember to do this, use it. But this is about the sociocultural aspect of writing, and these all blend together. Remember that each of the aspects of writing are supposed to give us a way to zoom in and place individual facts about writing, or practices about writing, or help us understand something, so within a specific context. So the sociocultural aspect of writing, in case you couldn't tell, deals with the social interaction or the culture connected to writing. So there are a lot of parts of there are a lot of studies that people do that connect to this. Obviously, we could draw from social sciences, tons of stuff in humanities. Anytime we're dealing with people interacting, we're going to get into the sociocultural. So let's just try and define some of that a little bit. When we talk about sociocultural generally, we are talking, one big thing we're talking about is the social dynamics of a system, a context, or a situation, a particular culture, or a particular environment. Basically, the sociocultural, when we look at it from a writing perspective, is taking everything you might get from an intro to sociology class, or an intro to multiculturalism class, and using all of that stuff as lenses for how writers operate in different contexts. But sociocultural deals with the social dynamics of a system, context, or situation. Sometimes there are models that talk about, in writing theory, in writing studies and rhetorical studies, we might see things described as rhetorical ecologies, like Jenny Edbauer's, I think, 2006 piece. We might see things like Marilyn Cooper's writing ecologies, things like that. We might talk about actor network theory or activity theory as applied to social systems. These usually show up in writing studies more with technical or professional writing, as they talk about actor network theory or activity theory. But I'm not going to dig into those too deeply here. It's just to say, like, here are some cool words that you can try and sound cool using, or go look them up if you want deeper study. But that talks about the social dynamics of a culture. Now, when we talk about culture comes from the root word for ethnos. It's where we get the same word ethnicity from, and it's essentially how we define people groups, shared behaviors, beliefs, or practices. And so we may see that with language or communication. Usually in my class, I'd say, let's brainstorm, and everybody else gets to shout these out. So take a minute. What's culture to you? I'll pause for about 12 seconds. Okay, that's all I'm giving. Sorry for being a goofball. You just get stuck with me. Actually, you could always pause and leave. Moving on. Culture. Could be language, communication. Could be clothing. Could be beliefs or ideologies from the French perspective du monde, which comes from Althusser, I believe. Traditions and values, whatever those are. Food can be a cultural identifier. Politics can be political stances, or just how the government runs can be culturally oriented. The religions or belief systems of a particular environment, and religion is different than just general beliefs. Religion has a specific theological orientation to it often, but it also is is a practice tied to a belief, and so there's a little bit of messiness that happens there. So religion, history, all of these things and more can be things that we identify broadly as culture. As writers, we have to think about how all of these things play into the context we're writing into. Each of these things, depending on the topic, some of these may be more salient or more important than others. And so we want to definitely take time to be aware of how these sorts of things, from our own background, like what our culture or cultures are, versus what someone else's culture or cultures are, how these things influence the way we write or the way we read. And so it's important to understand the back and forth that can happen, and be aware, going back to what we've already studied with rhetoric and audience. And if you haven't seen those videos, go find them. They're not that far on YouTube. So with that, that's the basics, the general sociocultural. And go take an intro to sociology course and then think, how does this change the way people write? And then you'll be at the sociocultural aspect of writing. With that, we want to apply these things to writing. With the sociocultural aspect of writing, broadly, there are beliefs that happen in our minds, or even kind of subconsciously. Sometimes there are things we believe that the individual may have, and then that individual, somehow along the way, those individuals' beliefs become shared beliefs that turn into norms, social norms, where there are people, members of a culture, understand that this is the way we do things, or this is what we believe, and sometimes that's unspoken or implicit or implied, and sometimes that's very explicit. Here's what we believe, and if you don't believe like us, take a hike. Sometimes that's how it shows up. Beliefs start individual, then turn into shared beliefs or group beliefs, then turn into expected norms or social norms that start changing behavior. And then when those behaviors and beliefs get codified or ratified officially in some sort of document, or by an authority or a governmental agency of some kind, they become conventions, which are often more explicitly stated practices that you use or that you do in this culture to show that you're a member. So we have beliefs that as the foundation of thinking that lead to common social norms or shared practices, and then we have ratified or confirmed or published conventions as this is the expectation when you're in this society or working with us. If you want to be a member, here's what you do. Those all turn into things with writing practice, and over time we've seen, just like anything with culture is very fluid, and over time writing practices change in different environments. We'll see people intentionally shift writing practices or shift the way they do things, shift those conventions over time because something's changed. Sometimes the technology's changed. Sometimes people will try and use writing and the way we write and the beliefs about writing or the conventions that we use. They'll try and change those to create a new culture or create cultural separation. This is actually what we see in the early 1800s when the first Webster's Dictionary came out, when American English kind of got, when the spellings of American words became officially put into a book. That was a big deal. There's the timing on that's really interesting historically. It comes right after, the War of 1812, where America showed that it could hold itself against Britain and create that distinction. So then we saw language become ratified and conventionalized to create social distance from British English and American English. It was kind of interesting. So we can see that happen. In the same way, we see microcultures even in college with have these shifts where APA and MLA, IEEE, which is the engineer's citation style, each AMA, there are all kinds of citation styles. Each of them is unique to a particular context. MLA is specifically used by English majors, literature majors for the most part, sometimes history. APA tends to be, is from the American Psychological Association, tends to be preferred in the social sciences, psychology, that sort of thing, but also biology and some of the sciences, especially the first, the undergrad years, the first 2 years, especially gen ed sciences, will use APA instead of their specialized style. But these are things that have official manuals that people have decided, voted on. They say this is the way you do this if you want to be like us, if you want to be a member of our culture. You write this way, you cite this way. So that can be really hard to make an adjustment to. It's also one of the reasons why people care about it so much. Some people look at citation styles, and we're getting really into the weeds at this point. Like, this is really practical. When you're told to use APA, or when you're told to use MLA, or whatever citation style you're told to use, the reason that that can matter, one, there's a practical side of it's an easy thing to grade, but two, the sociocultural implication for how well you do citation styles or formatting styles, it is a marker of identity. So if you are told to use APA format in a psychology classroom, your ability to do that is one thing that reflects how well you're becoming a psychologist. Same thing with MLA. Your ability to do MLA is a subconscious identifier for some teachers or for some readers that says they're doing this really well, so they're more of a member in my culture. They're more of a member for me. They're more like me than not. And so when those citation styles are ignored, or when you don't do them according to the laid out conventions, the reason some people care about those so much is because when it's a personal identity marker for them. With that's a lot on just beliefs, conventions, norms. But that's kind of a foundation for the sociocultural aspect of writing. How do beliefs turn into norms, turn into conventions, and how does that show up in writing? I'm just going to skip a bunch of other stuff that I usually do for now, just to get to this. When we're talking about those conventions, this is one example. So understanding this first step in the sociocultural as a writer is knowing when the beliefs have turned into audience expectations, or as social norms, or when they've turned into full-fledged conventions. Some genres are very, very, very explicit on how they do things because someone 100 years ago said this is what we do. IMRD format's really interesting this way. The history for it's really interesting. It was developed with very specific scientific values in mind, and so if you break the social convention of IMRD, you are, one, saying I'm not that kind of scientist. You're, two, saying I don't believe in those values that are embedded in this structure. And so it's really important when we talk about conventions. This would be the form of a genre convention. So we can talk about conventions. We can talk about how beliefs lead to shared norms or practices that then get ratified into official conventions that are explicitly published. But we can see conventions in the sociocultural in a variety of ways. We can see genre conventions at the linguistic level when we talk about spelling and punctuation. Those are social norms and grammar norms. Grammar, I've talked about it in another video, but we need to make a distinction between grammar, how we the knowledge we have about our language and the structure of language, versus grammar norms, which is the expectation of how things should be done when we write, and those are grammar norms versus grammar. We also have syntactic structures. There are common genres, simple sentences, compound complex sentences, and so on and so forth. Common structures that people are expected to use at a language sentence level. But then there are structural conventions, like I said, IMRD. There are rhetorical conventions, which are preferred ways to accomplish a writer's purpose in certain contexts. There are some things that if you say something in a certain way, in a certain context, in a certain genre, the readers will shut down. In some cases, it could be that you're expected to lay your thesis out very quickly because the culture has said, put your thesis at the end of the first paragraph, and like a traditional essay. There are other contexts where if you do that, you'll alienate your audience, and so that's where we have that other Rogerian model in. And so we want to think about how the context shapes the writing practices, the beliefs about writing, and the writing culture, So I think that's where I'm going to leave off. I have talked about the scientific conventions in other places, the beliefs about what counts as knowledge in a society. And so you can go look up some of my videos from the scientific aspect of writing for that one. But for now, as we open up this dialogue about the sociocultural aspect of writing, it is when a writer is trying to practice it or a reader is trying to understand what they're reading, it is acknowledging that both I as an individual have a specific belief system or complex set of beliefs that show up in my everyday actions, and specifically when it comes to writing, may change the way I write, depending on what I see as official identity markers or membership markers in a particular culture. And so it happens in other places other than writing, but we're talking about how this principle applies as a writer and why we should care about it. We'll talk more about this in other videos. Yes, pause there.